I love being with pastors. As many of you know, it's one of the center parts of my life for a long time has been our pastoral vocation, and trying to understand it and trying to speak and write about it in such a way that it is renewed and re-energized and refocused. I think our pastoral vocation has been diminished a great deal in my lifetime. Started before that, I guess. But I envy you now doing what you're doing, because I don't preach anymore. I realized shortly after I left my congregation 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago now, that I didn't like preaching without my own congregation. Preaching wasn't preaching if I didn't know these people. And to tell you the truth, I didn't miss it. I really didn't miss preaching, but I realized I did miss that hour of worship, that act of worship. And I was just talking to my wife yesterday at breakfast, and I think I've been wrong to say I didn't miss preaching. I think I have more than I realized, but it wasn't just standing in the pulpit that I miss. What I miss is what you get to do every week. I loved this sense of all week long having a text or a passage of Scripture and praying it, thinking about it, but gathering the whole congregation and community into that. And letting the people I was with, the congregation, the community, be shaped by that text and given meaning and purpose and energy. So that when I walked into the pulpit on Sunday, it was like I had all that stuff with me and all that in my mind, my imagination, my words, and I missed that. I don't do that anymore. I do it in a way, but not the way you're doing it. And I've realized, as I've been thinking about that, what a wonderful privilege that is. Nobody else gets to do that. Now, I guess people could, just in their private devotions, but you're not in touch with all the people you are. The births and deaths, the hospitals, the divorces, the addictions, the children playing, the whole thing, even session meetings. I shouldn't even have said that. I loved almost everything I did as a pastor. And I felt, kind of good at it. I was a pastor for just 30 years in Bel Air. I never left a session meeting feeling like I'd done gospel work. I tried everything. I let people told me what to do and prayed for me, and unanswered prayers. I never did get the session thing down. That's beside the point. What I just wanted to say, though, is that what you're doing is nobody gets to do what we get to do. And what makes me angry is when people distract us from doing it and seduce us into doing other things, and we get harassed and busy and thinned out, and we're not enjoying might not be quite the right word, we're not living out of that uniqueness that a pastor has. And I think it is a unique thing. There's nothing quite like what we're doing. Karl Barth used to say that there's nothing analogous to the church. You can't understand the church by analogy with any other social grouping of people. And I know that's true, but I think pastor is in the same category. There's nothing quite like what we're doing, and I just want to thank you for doing it, and envy you that you get to do it. I sit in church every Sunday now, and it's a little church, and we love the place, and I never want to be up in the pulpit instead of weighing my pastor, but every once in a while I get that sense, I wish I could do this again. But I'm trying to be obedient to what God's calling me to do it, and that's not what it is right now. So that's it. I don't want to digress too far, but you're all tired, and let's just kind of enjoy each other tonight. After I resigned my congregation, I went to Pittsburgh for a year, and to the seminary, and they invited me to be a writer, pastor, in residence, and that's where I started the message. But we still had our home in Bel Air, and we came home for Thanksgiving. It was in October. It was Halloween. I don't know why we were there for Halloween. And there were kids coming and trick-or-treating. And we're sitting there at the dinner table, my wife and I, and we had a friend who was with us, and the children would come and trick-or-treat, and we'd give them stuff. But our living room window was exposed, and everybody could look in and see us sitting there. And one of these groups of children came, and this little girl, about 7 or 8 years old, looked in and said, "Pastor Pete." And all the kids in my church called me Pastor Pete. And it was just kind of that, oh, I never get to hear that anymore. Nobody ever calls me pastor. And it was like just that little child's voice out of the past. It was just a memory of something so rich, relationships so complex and intricate. But there's an old man in our congregation now. It's a Lutheran congregation. He's 80 years old, and he always calls me pastor. So I still get a little bit of it. It's better from 7-year-olds, actually. Well, let me tell you what I want to do. And we'll just do an introduction tonight. But I want to talk about gospel-shaped lives and use our 4 canonical gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I've been a pastor most of my adult life. And then at the end, for 6 years, I left Region 3 years ago, but for the 6 years before that, I was a professor. And that was a great gift. Being at Regent, it was a wonderful time, and I'm really glad we got to do that. But, I wasn't a very good professor. After about 6 weeks there, I went to the president and the dean. I said, you got the wrong person. I'm not a professor. I'm a pastor. And I'm willing to resign right now. And they just laughed at me and they said, well, why do you think we hired you? But I could never fit into that academic mentality. And then all that time, before that and since then, I've been given again the great privilege of translating the Bible into our language. And it's very, very much a pastoral act. It's nothing I could have ever prepared for academically. It was It was those years of listening to people, praying with them, entering their lives, that gave me the idiom, the rhythms, the tone, which hopefully has come into the message. But one of the things that I've been thinking about as I've been doing this is that these people who first wrote this, told the stories, preached the sermons, and then often it was an oral tradition a long time before it got written, they were more like pastors than anything else. They were immersed in the lives of people, and they were listening both ways, and they were trying to get this language or this word into the language of these people, and they were incredibly successful. They were just so present to the way people talked. And recently, since I've been thinking about coming to see you, I've been thinking about these four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they're probably more like pastors than anything else. They were writing, taking materials that they had before them that were part of their memory, part of the oral tradition of the early church, and they weren't just writing stuff. They were writing materials that shaped people's imagination and got them into the story. I don't know if you're all too young, I think, to remember Charles Fuller and the Old-Fashioned Revival Hour. Some of you, I thought this was the young West Coast pastors. Well, every Sunday afternoon at 5 o'clock in our home, we'd gather around my parents, my sister, and my little brother. We'd gather around the Philco radio, a table model radio, in our living room, and we'd listen to the Old-Fashioned Revival Hour. It's the only religious radio program I ever remember listening to. But it was our family Sunday ritual. We listened to that. At one point, my Aunt Julia, who was kind of a skinny, matronly Norwegian woman who never smiled, or she wasn't aunt-like. She was just kind of a fixture. But she traveled to Long Beach, California, and attended the Old-Fashioned Revival Hour in person. And we knew when she was there, and so when they sang, when that congregation sang, my mother said, "Now, Aunt Julia is singing with them. See if you can hear her voice." And I strained and I heard her voice. And when my Aunt Julia came back from California, she was canonized in my imagination. I mean, she had been to the top. This was Sinai, Jerusalem, Tabor, the Vatican, everything all rolled into one. And she had been part of the Old-Fashioned Revival Hour, and I had heard her there. I never liked Charles Fuller's sermons much. He got all tangled up in tabernacle symbolism and the Levitical sacrifices, and I kind of got tired. And I really kind of got sick of honey in her letters. But what really came alive for me was the quartet. Rudy Atley on the piano and that men's quartet. And that just, my kids grew up listening to the Beatles, and I grew up listening to Rudy Atley and the Old-Fashioned Revival Hour Quartet. My favorite, I think, is This World Is Not My Home, I'm Just a Passing Through. But the old ark's a mover and a mover and a mover, and I like that pretty well too. And when I learned how to play the banjo, that's the first thing I learned how to play was the old ark. Nobody listened to me the way I listened to them. But it was part of my heritage. Those four voices, in harmony and in rhythm, as we huddled around that Philco radio in Kalispell, Montana, gave me a sense of what gospel quartet was. Later on, I became a student of the Bible in college and seminary, and the professors did their best to distract me into unmusical interpretations of the Gospels. And they told me about Q, and I had to write papers about Q, and about the authorship of John, and I paid attention long enough to complete the work assignments that they were giving me. And sometimes I'd even get interested. You know, there was a lot of puzzling detective work going on, and you can't help getting interested in some of that as you go along. But one of the things that always struck me as odd was when my professors would use the word harmony to talk about what they were doing. And we have that synoptic harmony, you know, of the Gospels, and mostly what it's there to do is show you how out of tune they were with each other. And so when I got out of school, I started being a pastor and preaching and teaching. I think I pretty much forgot all that stuff. I wanted to hear the harmony. I wanted to hear the way those four voices worked together, and the way the Christian community has heard them as a quartet for all these centuries. And that's what I want to do with you for these next few days. I want to try to hear the music and how this gives shape to our imagination and our faith, the way we live our lives. Let these four pastors do their work with us and help us do that with the people that we're in charge of. My thesis is that the Gospels are written in such a way as to give a gospel shape to our lives. They're not just simply accounts of Jesus or information given to us to build a theology out of. They're works of inspired imagination. These are writers. These men write. They know how to write. And they form us. Writing forms. It doesn't just inform, it forms. And if we submit our lives to them, they impress a gospel shape on our lives. Louis Boyer, the French theologian, historian, talks about the Gospels as presenting us with formed spiritualities. These are spiritual formational documents. Well, we all know that what you read and look at shapes who you are, shapes your life. The people you hang around shape your language, your behavior. That's why we pay attention to who our kids are hanging around. And we don't want them to be hanging around the people who shape them, misshape them. We know that the harm that pornography, say, inflicts on the soul, and it's not the nude bodies, it's not the acts of sexual intercourse that are wrong. It's the way they're presented to us. It's this dehumanized, depersonalized, derelationalized. It's sex without intimacy, sex without love, sex without commitment. And so it matters to our sexual lives or disorders our sexual lives to be in that kind of depersonalized, I was going to say intimacy, but false intimacy or denial of intimacy. So it makes a difference, and we care about that. The form in which words come to us matters. If we're yelled at constantly, told what to do, what not to do, given orders, directions, it forms a way of life in us. We get our identity out of wanting to please others, or it could be the opposite of that, wanting to rebel against others. It works both ways. If we're primarily given information to memorize or data to master, it forms a way of life in us. We get our identity out of knowing what the score is. And we develop our brains at the expense of our hearts and our emotions, our imaginations. If we're primarily exhorted to do better, to achieve, it shapes the way we are. We get our identity out of achievement, out of performance, out of competition. And we learn to evaluate others impersonally, usually as impediments to our achievement. But if we're primarily addressed in the form of story, in narrative, we are gathered into something that has meaning and plot and purpose. Character and significance are embedded in us, seeds of it are anyway, and we find ourselves more or less at home in the world and in community. Life has a story shape. Now, not everybody believes this. The postmodern deconstructionists don't believe that, but I just think they're dead wrong. Life has a story shape. And this story shape has been hurt, deteriorated by the way we conduct our lives culturally, usually in our schooling. But still, the storyteller is the primary person who orients us to who we are, the way life works with us. And it's highly significant that God reveals himself in Jesus through story. The revelation is written in a story form. There are alternatives to story-shaped lives, and we're surrounded with them, but the alternatives are always destructive of the gospel. The story gives shape to the truth, which is congruent with the way we are made relationally for love, for service, for sacrifice. And if you abstract facts out of a story or take truths out of a story and just use those, they're not just not as good as they used to be, but they're actually harmful because we're now using truth in a non-relational way, without a plot, without context. So it's very important that we take seriously what God has given to us in the Revelation, and in particular right now, in terms of these four Gospels. There's a wonderful line in one of Walker Percy's novels about the woman who got all A's and flunked life. And there's plenty of that in the Christian community. We started out being God-shaped, made in the image of God, formed by the fingers of God. And then the catastrophe, we fell, but our origins are still there. And it takes constant work, help, whatever, to do this. I was lucky in this. I had a storytelling mother and storytelling uncles. So I grew up in a world that was full of stories. One of the genres of storytelling that were popular in our family was trolls. That's a Norwegian story form, and my mother was good at it, and she would tell stories. She was the youngest of 13 children who came over from Norway, and so she would tell stories about the giants and the trolls in Norway, and spin these tales of my uncles and the giants and the trolls. I never knew where the trolls left off and my uncles started. It just was all kind of one huge Nordic mythology that went on. So I've picked it up and do it myself. I usually try to get the grandchildren are about the only audience I have left. I don't have a congregation anymore, so I use them. And I usually try to get them worked into the story somehow. But sometimes I miss it. I just forget. And one day, my little grandchild, he was about 4 or 5 years old at the time, he said, "Papa, tell me a troll story, but make sure I get in it." Well, you know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do that. They make sure we get in it. They're just great storytellers, and they know how to get us included in the story. This is just an irrelevancy, but I can't help. I mean, it comes to my mind, so you're stuck with me. Well, we live on a lake, and there's a cliff about 20 feet down to the water over here, and then there's a path that slopes down, and we have a boat dock and a little beach that we can swim from and tie our boats up. And when you are sitting down on the beach or on the dock, you look up, and on this cliff there's a Rocky Mountain juniper, which is kind of scraggly trees, but it has one limb that comes out over the water with a bushy, it's a diseased thing, it is what it is, but it looks just like a big bushy tail on this long, slim stalk. So one day we're sitting down there, and our 5 grandchildren, and one of them says, "Papa, what is that?" And in a moment of gospel inspiration, I said, "Well, that's Scogan's tail. Do you want to hear the story of Scogan's tail?" And they did. So I said, "Well, when my grandparents came over from Norway, they were on a farm, and they had trolls, but they had one troll that they really liked. Trolls are really a nuisance mostly. They're mischievous. They're playing tricks on you all the time. They're tipping over the milk bucket and pulling your chair out from under you, and they're a mess. But Scogan they really were fond of Scogan. He was so cute, and he had this tail. Trolls don't usually have tails. If they do, they're just scrubby little things. But Scogan had this really magnificent tail, and he was so vain. He was just so proud of this tail. He was always kind of looking at it and going down to the water and seeing it in the mirror of the water. And he just thought this tail was the most wonderful thing. And so when they came over to America, they couldn't leave Scogan behind. Now, I don't know if you know this, but trolls stink. They have an awful odor. And there's no way you can clean them up. They're just awful. And so they made a box for him, and they put holes in the box. And on the ship, as they came over, they kept moving this box around so people wouldn't know where the stink was coming from. And but there were 13 kids, so they had plenty of manpower, woman power to do that. Then they got to New York, and they took the train. The train had gone through by then. This was 1898, and the train had gone through the mountains into the little valley of where we live in Montana. And they had to do the same thing on the train. They had to keep moving the box around so people wouldn't find out where the stink was coming from, and they'd throw it off and get rid of the troll. So they finally got to our little valley, and And they let Scogan out of the box, and he just went wild. It was just like Norway. And he ran around and jumped in the lake and ran up and down the cliff and played on the rocks. And it was just glorious. Well, he had one thing which was a little bit irritating. He loved to nip off your toes when you were in the water. So all my uncles and aunts walked funny because they'd all lost 3 or 4 toes. They would just lurch along, and some had to walk on their heels. And it was really just a parade to see my uncles and aunts walking because they all had different gaits, and sometimes they'd fall and lurch, and they'd help each other. But he was so cute that they just couldn't get rid of him. So they just put up with him. But one day they had the preacher down for Sunday dinner. And Scogan got really excited having a preacher there. And he got carried away, and he took off the preacher's whole leg. Well, that was just too much. They just couldn't handle that. So they took off and started chasing Scogan, and he ran up from the water. And he ran up on this cliff, and he jumped, and he caught his tail in that Rocky Mountain juniper, and it ripped off. And there it is, hanging there still. And he was so vain about his tail that he's never been seen again. He just hides. He's in the water mostly. Every once in a while, you get a sniff of him. You smell him and you know he's around. But nobody's seen him for 70, 80 years now. Trolls have a long life. Well, I told this story, and my little granddaughter, Lindsay, said, Pop, is that true? I said, no, Lindsay, I made it all up. Are you sure? I said, no, it's okay. I just made it all up. There's no Scogan. Are you sure? And she wouldn't go swimming. So I thought, I've really done it now. I've corrupted this poor kid's imagination. She never want to go in the water again. And then they went home, back to Spokane. Those were the kids that live in Spokane. So a couple months later, Jan and I were over there, and they, after supper, it was time for bed, and the kids said, tell us a troll story. So I went into the bedroom, and they all hunkered down, and I told them a story. And sometimes they just don't work. And it was flat. Nothing took off. And so Lindsay said, Pop, would you tell us another one? Could you tell us a story about a troll who loves body parts? So I knew she was okay. Now what I want to do is, I'm not going to tell you any more troll stories, just relax. I want to take these 4 gospel stories. I'll do 2 tomorrow. I'll do Matthew, Mark tomorrow, Luke on Wednesday, John on Thursday, and on Friday, I'm going to take all those 4 stories and work them all together and try to see if we can hear the quartet, hear all that going on together. I have a good friend an Australian. He was a surfing bum, and he became a Christian about the age of 20, 21 in a quite remarkable way, but he had no instruction. He didn't have a pastor. There was somebody who witnessed to him on the beach, and he became a Christian and started reading the Bible, the New Testament. And he, like people of that generation, I guess this one too, he was full of New Age kind of stuff. And he read the 4 Gospels straight through, and he thought that this was evidence of transmigration, because it was the same story every time, but it was a little different. So this must have been transmigration. And it took him years before he learned about these were all the same story. We've got these precious, precious stories, and they're working off of the same plot. And I want to try to see, just enlist you with me to look at these, look at the details of these stories, see how they work, see this gospel-shaped spirituality. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were modest writers. Not a typical trait among writers. And none claim authorship. But the early generations of those who read them wrote in their names soon enough. They not only named the writers, but they kept the four together in company: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And those four gospel writers have kept congenial company ever since. An old nursery rhyme addresses them in prayer: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, bless the bed I lie upon, and if I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Amen.